Welcome, everyone. I would love to start by expressing our deep gratitude to CJP for supporting our congregation and congregations throughout Boston, now and always. As a connector of communities and a convener of learning opportunities like today's, you engage us, you invite us to contend with ideas that matter together. You invite us wherever we are on the political or denominational spectrum to come together as Am Echad, Lev Echad, one people, one heart. And so I want to thank you, Rabbi Mark Baker and CJP, for giving us a template of what holy community can be. In a few moments, Mark will share a few opening words. But before that, I'm also so honored to be able to thank Dr. Ruth Nemzoff, who we are blessed to walk through life with here at Temple Emmanuel, and invite you, Ruth, to share your love and pride for your son-in-law, Evan Osnos, by introducing him now.
All right, welcome everyone. I am thrilled at the request of my Rabbi Wes Garden-Schwartz, who is a huge fan of Evan, to welcome and introduce Evan Osnos with my husband, Herman. So what I want to tell you about him is you may know him already because you've seen him as a CNN commentator. You've probably heard him on NPR. You know he's the National Book Award winner from 2014, for his book on China called Age of Ambition. And maybe you know him as the Pulitzer Prize winner from 2008, where he wrote for investigative reporting. He got the Pulitzer Prize. But in our family, he's known as a good in-law. And he's known as a wonderful in-law to my husband and to me. And he's the father of two of our youngest grandchildren. And he is a superb in-law brother, a wonderful uncle to his 9 nieces and nephew. And that's just on our side. Evan is from a 70+ person extended, loving and loyal family. And he has also been the product of some terrific parenting, Susan Peter Osnos. And I tell you this because while his awards and his talent qualified him to write the biography of our president, what really gave him the understanding of human relationships is he's been learning since the cradle about the insight needed to understand human relationships. And it's given him the insight and the Rahmanis to write a balanced book about our president. So I proudly present to you my son-in-law, or our son-in-law, I should say, Sarah Beth Berman's husband, and President Biden's biographer, Evan Osnos. But before he gets on, I want a word from our sponsor, Mark Baker from CJP.
And if I can, Mark, even before you jump in, if it's possible for me to thank Ruth, I do just want to take that chance. I am just, as some people, I don't know if I'm on the screen or not, but if people, if they know anything about our family, they know that I hit the in-law sweepstakes. I am just a grateful and lucky son-in-law of Ruth and Harris Berman. And I think she used the most important description for me today, which is the husband of Sarah Beth Berman. So with that, over to you, Mark. Thank you all for the hosting today, and I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thanks so much, Evan. Thank you so much, Ruth. That was beautiful. I think I can speak for all of us that say we'd love to be introduced as a Pulitzer Prize winner, but more than that, we'd like to be introduced by our mother-in-law like that. That was really beautiful. And I think it really reflects the spirit of what this event is all about today. And it's why CJP is so proud to be co-hosting this with our friends from Temple Emmanuel. Thank you so much, Rabbi Robinson, of course, Rabbi Garden-Schwartz. Actually, when I read that book, your book, Evan, and I read about Joe Biden's kind of voracious love of people, and then I just hear Ruth's talking about relationships, I actually thought about the incredible work that Temple Emmanuel and your leadership have done, Michelle, over this past year. You've done obviously incredible virtual programs, Zoom services, life cycles, found ways to be there for people, virtual learning. But a week doesn't go by when I do not hear people sing the praises of your leadership because of relationships. They call me, they check in on me. I feel seen, I feel heard. That's what makes Kihila Kidosha, Holy Community. And I know that's what Temple Emmanuel is all about. So thank you. And we're so proud to be doing this together with you. When I heard about this opportunity to host Evan, the other thing I thought about was the many, many conversations I have probably daily with members of our Jewish community who are just struggling to make sense of this moment. Of course, we're in the midst of multiple crises, one of which is a crisis in our democracy and our politics. And these community members, some of whom, by the way, have very strong political views on one side or the other. We have both here in Boston. Others who aren't sure what to think, but they just have deep concerns about the future of our country, our democracy, our politics, our leadership. And everyone is asking, what is this moment going to mean for this country we love? What is it going to mean for the Jewish community? And I believe, and I think, Michelle, we've talked about this, that as American Jews, these are conversations we are obligated to be having. We need to be exploring, what does it mean for us as American Jewish citizens right now? What do we need to do, grounded in and inspired by our Jewish wisdom and our Jewish values, in order to build the country we have always loved living in and aspire to continue living in? I think as a community, we need to create new conversations of consequence that will help shape the future to come, that will help define the character of our community. And we need to contribute our voices to the broader American and global conversations about the world for which we feel responsible and that we aspire to build. And I think this kind of conversation of consequence is exactly what Evan is doing in this book, as he gives us insight into this president, but also in the spirit of the title, why this president matters for us right now. So to me, this conversation today is a reflection of the kinds of questions we should be asking, the kinds of thoughtful, values-driven people with whom we need to be in conversation. So thank you all for being here today. Evan, thank you for writing this book, and thank you in advance for educating us and inspiring us and challenging us today. And I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Evan, you're known as the back cover of this new book that you have written, attests as a China expert. In fact, it says that you have chronicled the remarkable changes in the personal lives of the Chinese populace over the last 35 years. Can you tell us your story? How did you go from writing about China to writing a biography of Joe Biden?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Mark. I have to say it's a real pleasure to be here with you today. I think all of us are. Look, we're grateful for a lot of things today. We're grateful that the lights are on. It's warm and cozy where we are. We're thinking of people who are not in that situation. But I am grateful to be a part of this community, to have a conversation of consequence, as Mark said, and it's a subject of tremendous urgency. Let's be blunt, right? I mean, this is a moment in American life in which we can feel, I think all of us, like we're sort of on the knife's edge at any moment here, between a kind of future that we all want and something more fragile, something much more divided. And so why did I come to this? I am a foreign correspondent. I mean, that is my nature. And I will, if you'll permit me 2 seconds on the sort of backstory, I come to the idea of being a foreign correspondent sort of with deeper origins. I mean, my family, if you go back a few generations, has been more or less in the scribbling business for quite a long time. I mean, my great grandfather, Zygmunt Bachowski, in Warsaw, he was a neurologist, but he wrote articles for Jewish newspapers about the, Russo-Japanese War in the turn of the 19th century. This is, I'm afraid this is baked into who I am, and all the way up through my father, Peter Osnos, who was a refugee who came to this country. They left Poland and obviously He was born actually in India on the way, as so many people I think on this call will recognize, found his way to this country and became a journalist and became a writer and became ultimately a book publisher. And he and my mother, Susan, they really sort of raised me to feel at home in the world. And I think if I'm being honest, look, I was born on third base when it comes to the writing business, and I try to remember that every day. And what it means is that I felt this sense as the last couple of years were gathering. I felt honestly a bit like a foreign correspondent here in the United States. I'm an American, but there was so much about our politics that looked hard for me to understand. I came back from a decade abroad in 2013. The first thing that happened, the first day I came back to Washington, the government shut down. The first time it had happened in decades. And I thought to myself, what is happening? How did our politics get to be what they are? How did we get so divided? And what might it be that would lead us out of this? And I was actually interested in who was doing the kinds of things. I went looking for people who were doing foreign affairs. That's what I spent a lot of my career doing, foreign affairs and national security. People said, you should go see Joe Biden. He's in the vice presidency, which of course is the most maligned job in Washington. And what that meant was that he was frankly not a hard interview to get in 2013, 2014, which is insane because he was also at the center of so much important work that was happening all around the world. So I started to go see him. And what I discovered was that sitting there talking to him, he was, frankly, he was a little more blunt than a lot of other people I would go interview in Washington. It was not his first rodeo. He'd been through some political battles in his life. As somebody said to me, one of his advisors, Ted Kaufman, at one point said to me, Joe Biden is the luckiest person I know and also the unluckiest person I know. And there was a kind of deep truth in that. But I want to say something very clear, Michelle, which is that, I started to go see him. I'd see him again and again over the years, and that became the makings of this book. But I come to this very much as a reporter. I am not a spokesman. I am not a member of the Biden team. I am somebody who is trying, I think like any American citizen, in effect, to try to understand this complicated mix of humanity that has made up this life. What has shaped his mind? What does he carry with him? What does he lack? What have been the moments in his life that have given him a sense of how this country works and how the rest of the world works? That's what I bring to this project. That was the motivation behind it. And look, I will give away for people who are wondering what a book like this is about. I will tell you that the honest, the short description is I came to see Joe Biden as a life in full. It was he's a life that has been filled with moments of tragedy and moments of error, mistakes that he has made, and also moments ultimately of self-reflection. And that's what kept me coming back. The secret sauce of any good writing in the end, frankly, is self-reflection, the ability to regret, the ability to look upon our own lives with some distance and be able to talk about it. And he was able to do that. And that's why he made a rewarding subject for a biography.
Evan, thank you so much. You speak about Biden's complicated mix of humanity and his life in full. And your book opens with you vividly painting Joe Biden's near-death collapse in a hotel room after a relentless campaign in 1988, during which he had ignored the headaches that he was having that ultimately proved to be warnings of a cranial aneurysm. What spoke to you about this incident as an orienting window in Biden's soul?
Yeah, Michelle, I'm glad you mentioned that because I found that episode in his life to be in its own way quite revealing. This is something we don't talk about that much when we talk about the 46th president of the United States, which was that he found himself one morning in the winter of 1988 lying flat on his back on a hotel room floor, unable to move his legs. And he had no idea how he'd gotten there. And he was sort of able to eventually haul himself up onto the bed. He had this catastrophic set of aneurysms. They sort of hustled him off to the hospital, where the surgeons said this is so grave that they called in a priest to deliver last rites because they thought he might not survive. I honestly, you know, this was happening. He was 44 years old. I'm 44 years old. When I was kind of learning about this episode, I was thinking about what it would be like as a young father, somebody who had, in his case, this extraordinary life around him, and also all of it just kind of slipping through his fingers. But the reason why it mattered, the context matters. He had just bombed out of the '88 presidential race, and he had bombed out, if he was being honest, and he sort of talks about it in these terms. He said later, the reason I fell out of that race was that I was, to use his word, too arrogant. I wasn't ready to be president. And what had happened was, he had taken things for granted. He'd gotten a little too casual on the stump. He ended up, as we know, taking the words of the British politician Neil Kinnock. But his ability to, and there was a moment, actually the moment, Michelle, that really made that, I think, the natural starting point for this book, was that he was getting prepped for surgery. And a doctor said to him, you know, you're a very lucky man. And he thought to himself, how in God's name am I a lucky man? Here I am, you're telling me that I may lose the ability to speak. I am on death's door. And they said, well, because if you had not failed out of that presidential race and you were still trooping around New Hampshire in the dead of winter, you probably would be dead right now. And when he finally came back after months and months of recovery, he gets back to the Senate. And one of the first speeches he gives, he says, I feel as if it's a second chance on life. And I think that awareness of how we are, all of us, a hair's breadth away from catastrophe, no matter how self-satisfied we may be, is a piece of political equipment that became important to him. It's part of the reason why he then was able to go on, and eventually Americans, for all of our differences, kind of saw something in this person who might be of value to us at a moment when all of us, as a collective political society, are really right very close to the edge of the difference between success and failure.
That's beautiful. And I think we discussed as we prepared for this that, you know, before we get into the policy stuff, and we will shortly, we really wanted to kind of pause and talk about the humanity of this leader, because there's so much for us to reflect on and to learn from it. So I want to just pick up on that theme. And I love these phrases, a life in full. And I was actually going to read that excerpt that you quoted when he said, I didn't deserve to be president because of my arrogance. You know, I can't help but think about the concept of tshuva in our tradition, of repentance, which involves something that we have too little of in this world, which is actual regret, let alone public regret for a public figure. So I'm just fascinated by this aspect of his personality and the kind of willingness to almost publicly and transparently own his own failures. I also want to say, you know, I had read, and I think Ruth quoted this, that this was a balanced a portrait of him, but I have to admit I was a little suspicious, maybe because the cover is so great. You know, I was expecting this to be like a rah-rah Joe Biden book, and you took on complicated stuff about his past, like the failed presidential campaign, comments and policies, stances towards race and crime, his behavior toward women. You know, there's a lot of problematic stuff in this president's past, and I'm struck by the fact that I think we're living at a time when, like, especially with our political leaders, it's so hard for us to both admire and critique at the same time. Like, it feels like we're either in camps, like we're taking him down or we're defending him. And so I just would love to hear how you approached, you know, kind of Joe Biden with eyes wide open, you know, in an effort to actually write a balanced portrait and what we can learn from that.
Yeah, I have to say, Mark, you know, I'm talking to you today about a mile from the White House. You know, I'm here at home, and, you know, living in Washington in this period, I think there is a level of, there's a kind of, I think you have to make a choice about whether you're willing to believe in the possibility of goodness in politics. You have to be willing to say to yourself, is it possible that folks are going into this business for the right reasons, that it's not simply naked ambition in whatever the latest, most convenient form it is, that somebody has something they're trying to do? And look, I'll state the obvious. Joe Biden can be quite lavishly criticized from all angles by the Jewish community, by the Protestant evangelical community, by the Catholic community. And we haven't even talked about the millennials. So there is this way in which he is, I think, a natural target and a fair target for a lot of the things that we talk about when we're really talking about American culture. I'll be more specific. Cornell William Brooks, who is a great civil rights leader, teaches at the Kennedy School now, and former head of the NAACP, he said to me, look, because he is in contact with a lot of young, particularly Black activists who say about Joe Biden, I don't like what he did on the crime bill in the 1990s. I don't like the way that he was against court-ordered busing in the 70s and so on. But as Cornell William Brooks will tell you, he says, look, you cannot take issue with Joe Biden's career without reckoning with two facts. One, his life is really the story of the Democratic Party in many ways, and American politics writ large, that it has gone through this evolution where it has been on various places on race, on notions of equity, on what it means to be inclusive in our politics, and he has moved with it. And so in some ways, he is the story of the last 50 years of American politics, and none of us are innocent in that regard. And then the other piece of it, which I think is important, as Dr. Brooks said, was you have to be able to look at his ability to acknowledge his own learning. Where has he been wrong on things and where has he tried to learn? And last night, Mark, if anybody watched the CNN town hall in which President Biden was kind of having one of his first moments with the public, there was a telling little moment sort of towards the end where he was talking about the young generation. And there is, to be honest, Joe Biden is obviously older and more conservative, actually, than most Democrats. And yet he opens himself to the possibility that he has things to learn. As he said last night, he said, they're not like us. They're more open. They're more inclusive, talking about this young generation. And I think, there are a lot of moments over the course of the next 3.5, 4 years when he's going to get a hole in the head from, he's going to get pressured from the left. But the young liberal progressive activists so far have been saying, look, we like what he's doing on climate. We like what he's doing on issues that we think are about the future, not the past. And I think there is an element in which he is trying to balance those equities as much as he is all of the other communities, which I mentioned earlier in this comment.
Evan, you speak about Biden's willingness to look towards the future. You spoke about the challenge that we all have of our willingness to actually believe in the possibility of good, of movement. And one of the things that I'm struck by is the enigma of Joe Biden's religious life that you present here in this book. Can you talk to us a little bit about Biden's spirituality? You share in this book this incredibly powerful quote. Well, I didn't want to hear anything about a merciful God, no words, no prayer, no sermon gave me ease. I felt that God had played a horrible trick on me, and I was angry. And then you answer that, his words, with the words of Joseph P. Kennedy. When one of your loved ones goes out of your life, you think that he might have done with a few more years, and you wonder what you're going to do with the rest of yours. And then one day, because there's a world to be lived in, you find yourself a part of it, trying to accomplish something he did not have time to do. And perhaps that's the reason for it all. I'm really interested in why you brought that particular quote to answer, in a way, what Joseph Biden's own spiritual journey has been, because there's a word that we have for that kind of spiritual journey in Jewish tradition called shlichut, the power of a mission to make meaning of our lives. So I want to ask you, how does Biden's spirituality interplay with his own sense of mission, with his politics, and how do his politics interplay with his spirituality?
Joe Biden is a fairly rare creature in this city. He is a devout liberal. He is a deeply learned religious man, but he wears it privately. Interestingly enough, we're accustomed in Washington to having faith be kind of wielded very often as an artifact or an advertisement. People will sort of announce how much of a believer they are, whether it's sincere or not. Biden comes at it slightly differently. He is competent, he is confident in his faith, but he's not going to talk about it all the time unless it's appropriate. It's not his, from his perspective, it's not his to put in other people's lives unless it is of value to them. He can't get through a paragraph without quoting the liturgy, without quoting the Psalms, without quoting some piece of the tradition that helps give him meaning and gives form. So it goes all the way back to when he was a kid. This is, you read, I think brilliantly, Michelle chose these elements of his religious life that were the ways that he made sense of tragedy. And we'll talk about that. But before that, even before that, when he was coming up, he's a kid in Scranton, he's coming up in Delaware, as all of us know. And his life was built on two pillars: family and faith. These two things, they provided, in a sense, the kind of underground architecture for a functioning household in his mind. You were only as strong or as weak as the people you were connected to, your relationships, beginning at home and then extending out into the community. And then you were only as strong as your understanding of yourself in this long arc of tradition. To him, doesn't matter if you're Jewish, or you're Catholic, or anything else. You have a book. You have a putting down of ideas about how to be in the world, and that you are improved by your awareness of it. And he grew up, part of it was, he was raised by the nuns, but his family had a kind of respectful but sometimes tense relationship with the church. At one point, Joe Biden there was a nun who was saying to him, she was making fun of the fact that he had a stutter. And his mother, Jean Finnegan, who is a very formidable figure in his life, in his memory, she marched right down, and she was unbelievably devout, but she marched down to the school and she said to that nun, if you ever talk to him like that again, I'm going to tear that bonnet off your head. So there was a way in which he felt himself sort of inextricably a part of the church, but it was functional for him. He was taking things from his readings, from his learning. I had actually kind of an amazing interview in the course of writing the book with somebody who I did not expect to be not expect to be this kind of source of wisdom, and that's Stephen Colbert, the comedian, the actor. He and Biden have something in common, which is that they both have lost members of their family in accidents. In Stephen Colbert's case, he lost his father, his siblings, in a terrible plane crash. And later in life, he and Biden met. They'd never met each other before. And Biden had just lost his son, Beau Biden. It was in 2015. And he came to Stephen Colbert's show. And before they went out on stage, they met backstage for a long time. And I asked Stephen Colbert, I said, what did you talk about? And he said, well, and Colbert is a practicing, he's a practicing Catholic. And he said, we talked about our mothers, and we talked about religion, and we talked about the rosary. And most of all, we talked about grief. And he said, this is the thing that people don't understand. If they don't have the specific experience of grief, they don't understand that we treat it in public life like something radioactive. We don't want to touch it. If somebody else is grieving, and there's something almost kind of American about this, that it feels to us like it's that black hole that will suck you in, that people don't know how to talk about it. And Biden and Colbert, as Colbert said to me, he said, Joe Biden is not afflicted with that. He puts grief right out in front of all of us, and he forces us to contend with it. And he says, this is this artifact of our shared life together. All of us have it, whether either in large quantities or small quantities. And the difference is usually, forces beyond our control. But he says we are a fragile people, and we are grieving, and it is incumbent on all of us to acknowledge the others who are suffering. And what's interesting, that he said this to me before the COVID epidemic, before that was all happening. And in so many ways, I think that experience of grief, in some ways, the fact that Joe Biden is adept at grief, at finding within his traditions, finding ways of explaining and carrying on and persisting, that has turned out to be of great public meaning, whether he talks about it in explicitly religious terms or not. But it is, he practices a kind of pastoral presidency that turns out to be relevant to us right now.
You know, since you mentioned kind of the public meaning of Joe Biden and his character, you know, I want to ask you something about about him getting elected, and ask you to also zoom out and maybe share your take on what it says about us as a country that we elected him. Because one of your interviewees in the book, I think, summed up how many people responded to Biden's election as saying that that Biden can be the product of either your most cynical thinking or the product of your most optimistic thinking. And that was just such a striking kind of a way to frame it. Can you just dig into that a little bit more? Tell us a little bit, like, what does that mean, and how it can help us understand the fact that we elected this president?
Yeah, I think, you know, the person who mentioned that to me is a really interesting, thoughtful, young, progressive activist, somebody who, you know, in some ways was not that excited about a Joe Biden presidency. I mean, this was a candidate who had emerged from the most diverse field in the history of presidential politics. And, you know, there were very progressive candidates running. And instead, he became, you know, he was, after all, at that point, 77, now 78. He was the most conservative member of the field. In some ways, I think to young Americans, he felt like an agent of the past. And that was at the same time then juxtaposed this against this very interesting contrast. Because Joe Biden started the campaign, you remember saying to people, he said at a fundraiser, nothing is going to fundamentally change. That drove young progressives crazy. Actually, they made sort of mock-up posters like Obama's Hope poster in which they wrote, nothing is going to fundamentally change. Then you fast forward a few months and we're in the grip of the pandemic. The economy is in a tailspin. And Biden starts saying that he wants to be the most progressive president since FDR. And people began to say, well, how do I square these two things? Because one of these, how can this both be true? And I had an interview with President Obama at one point when I was preparing the book. And I put that question to him. I said, how can we square these two completely different portraits, self-portraits? And he said, you know, the truth is, it's not that Biden has changed. He said that what's changed is the circumstances, that we have now found ourselves at a moment, not only with the pandemic, but the pandemic has revealed to us these underlying fragilities and fault lines in our economics and our politics, that if we don't deal with them with really ambitious reforms, it's going to hobble this country. And if we don't take on questions of fairness, racism, inequality, we are not going to be able to make the kind of progress in the next generation that we were able to make when Joe Biden was coming up in the decades after World War II. And so in a way, Joe Biden has kind of recognized that and has sort of, almost despite himself, has come to the realization that this is a moment in which we cannot afford to make small plans. We have to be ambitious because the urgency is there. And I think that allows people to project onto him either their greatest hopes or their greatest worries. But in that subtle way, I think in some ways he's a mild person, but he bears this extraordinary moment, this kind of pregnant moment of possibility that gives this presidency very high stakes.
Wow, Evan, I'm so fascinated by what you have just shared, because one of my favorite lines in your book is where you speak about how liberals were so dismayed that the most diverse field in history had yielded this white man in his 8th decade. And you write here, it was as if a waiter had returned from the kitchen with news that the specials were gone and all that was left was oatmeal. The idea of Biden as oatmeal is such an evocative image. And I want to ask you to go a little bit deeper with that in terms of how does Biden as oatmeal square with his moderation and his vision of social change? What do you think are both his assets to this moment and his liabilities right now?
Yeah, I will tell you, I even though occasionally I'll have a tough word like that about him, look, it's an honest appraisal of politics, and his, let's just say he and his advisors haven't kicked me out of their offices since then. I think there is a recognition. They know how they are perceived by large portions of the American public. They're not naive to this at all. They look very closely at perceptions of the presidency and his presidency. And in a curious way, Michelle, I think he is actually helped by low expectations, because remember, Barack Obama came into the presidency afflicted by the Nobel Peace Prize. As he would be the first to tell you, it was a terrible burden to come into office with people saying you are going to be a transcendent figure. Somehow, just by the sheer power of your rhetoric and your biography, you're going to cut through all of the barriers in American politics. Nobody says that about Joe Biden. And in fact, that is a great asset, because Biden's theory of politics is quite different than Barack Obama's. I think it's worth identifying this quite clearly. In some ways, President Obama believed that because in his life, he was this fusion of racial identities and different places, from Hawaii to Chicago to New York to California, and he lived in Indonesia, all of that. And then, of course, combined also his grandparents raised him partly in the Midwest, all of those elements. And then he was also somebody who came in talking about breaking down barriers between blue and red. And he did it with such rhetorical power that I think there was this feeling that he could in some ways escape the humid confinement of politics in Washington, those moments of close quarters combat and discussion that Biden, honestly, President Obama never particularly enjoyed. He didn't like getting in the room. I mean, there was a sort of funny moment when he said a few years ago when he was in the presidency, people keep telling me I have to go have a drink with Mitch McConnell. Well, you go have a drink with Mitch McConnell. And, the irony is, Joe Biden, even though he doesn't drink, he would love to go have a drink with Mitch McConnell. He'll have a Diet Coke. But the thing about Biden is, it's not that he's just the guy who is sort of always looking for a conversation. I think that's the shorthand. There's actually a deep, powerful sort of political point here. He believes in the possibility that you can get into a room and with the power of treating somebody across the table as worthy of respect by acknowledging that they come to this with their own interests, their own motives, their own reasoning, that you can have a reasoned negotiation. You can come through the power of argument and evidence, that you can come to some version of a truth. And, I've often sometimes thought that may be the most Jewish thing about Joe Biden, is that he believes in this sort of possibility of getting in the room and hashing it out. But that's actually, I think, a useful thing for us at this moment right now in our politics.
I love that. He would have been, he's like Talmudic, I mean, it's interesting. What I heard you just say is, in some ways, like, President Obama almost thought he could transcend politics, and Biden just loves the politics, politics in the best sense of the word. It's fascinating. All right. So we got to talk about Israel. I think that we can, this is part of a larger conversation, I think, about the president's foreign policy in general, but there's no question, since we announced this event, that the most comments and questions we've received have been about Israel. So here's how I would frame it. Let's remember, of course, there are members of our community who are hopeful and excited about Biden foreign policy in general, and I think about how he will approach Israel in the Middle East. We have a diverse community on every issue. That said, I think, since people heard about us in this conversation with you, a lot of questions and concerns have come in about Biden and Israel, concerns about the Obama administration, about the Iran deal. Why hasn't he reached out to Prime Minister Netanyahu? And I think just many are worried that, some of the progress that has been made in the last administration in securing peace between Israel and Arab states might be undone, or that he'll kind of bring back an old rule book for a new situation. So look, President Biden became the vice president more than a decade ago, and the Middle East has changed dramatically since then. But what can you tell us about what we should expect from a President Biden regarding Israel?
A couple of broad principles I think that are useful to keep in mind, and then a couple of specific things. I think as you think about how he's going about his foreign policy in relation to what has come before, there are ways in which he agrees and disagrees with certain things that the Trump administration did. But one of the things that he and his advisors are very mindful of is they want to take the good things that they see out of the last 4 years, and they want to hold on to those things. This applies in some ways to relationships with China. They look at it and they say, look, we would not have gone about it in the same way, but we wouldn't have introduced tariffs. But we're not going to suddenly remove tariffs that take away all of our leverage in negotiations. We're going to allow that process to play out. And we're going to give ourselves, in a sense, the dividend of where we think it has advantaged the United States and ultimately advantaged the world. That's a broad principle. When it comes to Israel, look, Joe Biden has been involved in the Middle East for a very long time. It goes back decades, and he has relationships there that go back 40 years in some cases. He's known Bibi Netanyahu since neither one of them had white hair. And I think, it's worth mentioning, they did speak during the transition. He actually was one of the earliest calls he had, but they haven't spoken to the presidency. We're all very aware of that. I think, I can't speak in much more detail. I think you're going to be hearing some news on that very soon about that contact. But a couple of broad principles that are useful, specific principles when it comes to Israel policy. They have said that they are very supportive of the Abraham Accords. They think this is progress. They see this as something they do not want. They have no intention of removing. That said, they're going to review the details. That's, as we know, that's essentially a kind of euphemism for looking at the kinds of commitments that were made, and when they think they need to bring pressure, particularly on some of the Arab states, they may do so. But you really, I don't think you want to give short shrift to the fact that they believe this is good for Israel. They also have said that Jerusalem is the capital. They believe that going forward. They think Tel Aviv will play some role as a piece of the diplomatic mission, but they're not moving the embassy. They have a couple of strategic ideas, which in preparation for our call, I was talking to folks in the administration. I was sort of thinking about this, and there are two important elements to keep in mind. Number one, they have said, and Biden really believes this, there are going to be disagreements between the United States and Israel. That doesn't mean, however, that it fundamentally undermines the seriousness and the closeness of this alliance. What he says is that they're going to try to have those disputes privately rather than publicly. That's an important idea. That's sort of one of the ways that you can try to move forward together. The other thing is that they've said, and it's no mystery here, they do hope to try to revive elements of the Iran deal. But what they say is they're going to do it. They don't want to, Israel won't be blindsided. They will do it in consultation with their allies in Israel. So look, I don't think that answer is going to satisfy people who are really worried. What I will tell you, though, and I mean this really sincerely. I say this on behalf of, somebody who cares a lot about the people, the lives of all the folks who are involved here, not only the interest for the United States, but interest for Israel, is that Biden and the people around him are very serious. They're very serious. They do their reading. They do the work. They're trying to think about the implications for American interests and security and policy. They're not doing this casually, and they're not doing it without full consideration. And I think that in and of itself is something that should give us some comfort. It may mean that we're going to have to get into the room as citizens and press and nudge to try to achieve policy outcomes. But I think it's worth giving them a chance to try to build what they think is a reasoned policy for the future.
can we dig in a little bit more on what Biden's likely policy with regard to Iran would be? You write at some length about Biden's experience in Iraq, and you conclude in your book that Biden expressed only a limited ambition to bring resolution in Iraq, saying we can't want unity and coherence, even though it's overwhelmingly in our interest more than they want it. And then you bring the case of him sharing with Netanyahu that there's no sense in dying on a small cross. So how do we square these two? How might Biden's previous takeaways, the aspirational no sense of dying on a small cross, and the very sober we can't want it more than they do, shape his understanding of the regional challenges that are posed by Iran today?
I should say, you know, when Biden was sitting in Israel in 2011 and he said to Bibi Netanyahu, there's no sense dying on a small cross. It was Ron Dermer who told me this story, Israeli ambassador to the United States, who said, and he said, look, when he said that, Netanyahu burst out laughing. And here it is, you know, to state all the obvious ways, it was, you know, quite a scene. And then Ron Dermer said, look, that was actually the most, this is Dermer's words, it's probably the most astute description of Israeli politics that I've ever heard. I think there was something about, and look, there's a way in which Biden is constantly trying to figure out where is what he calls the deal space. You know, where is it possible to try to make something happen? And he's always trying to think through, what is the person who I'm dealing with as a foreign diplomat or foreign head of state, what are they bringing into the room with them? What are their domestic politics? You know, what are the pressures on them? And what he concluded in Iraq was, as much as the United States wanted this place to cohere and come together, and we had this image of what it might be, what it might mean for the region, it simply wasn't going to happen. And we were going to drive ourselves nuts in the process. And I think there was an element of, but then at the same time, when, you know, he was looking at the peace process in Israel, and he was hoping that there might be this breakthrough. You know, there is that fine line between hoping for something and then, you know, trying to muscle it into place when it's not possible. And he has experience of both sides. One thing that I think is worth noting about the trajectory of his life and decision making is that his experience of supporting the invasion of Iraq was scorching for him, because he came to believe, of course, it was a terrible mistake and it was costly in American blood and treasure. And I think that chastened his belief in the application of American force abroad. He is noticeably, in the years since 2003, he's warier about sending American troops overseas, or about imagining that we can, just by fiat or by force, that we can bend the course of history in our favor, into our liking. And that is, you know, it's a powerful conclusion, and it's one you don't want to take too far. And you also are sort of glad that he's got it on his mind. But he comes to this with a fairly subtle sense of, there are times when you can make a deal and times when you can't. But he is a big believer that it is worth pursuing.
Mm. Speaking of being a big believer that it's worth pursuing, we have a very interesting question here in the chat about Joe Biden's having said that what ultimately led him to run for president in this time was the march in Charlottesville with the rallying cry of "Jews will not replace us," and his understanding that the words of a leader matter, and that there are forces in our nation that are worth trying to shape. This comment asks if you could please comment on anti-Semitism and racism as a motivating force for Biden, and what it might mean about what we're likely to see in his presidency moving forward.
Yeah, I think you cannot overstate how important this is in his motivations. You know, I was interviewing him over the summer, and, you know, there was a moment when we were talking when he became kind of gravely solemn. I mean, this was not a put on. You know, this was him to the point of almost being emotional. when he talked about the site of those torches in Charlottesville. And as he has said publicly, and he said to me, you know, the sight of the veins popping in the forehead, there was a kind of a violent imagery from our history that you simply cannot explain away. And that was the part of the motivation for him to get into this race, was because he looked at the other Democrats, and to be sort of unkind about it, he said, I don't think they can beat this guy. And he said, this president is fueling a form of hatred in American life that is a permanent gene. It is in us. And he said something that caught my attention. He said, look, I made a mistake. I believed that we could extinguish hate. And he said, look, I was somebody who grew up in segregated Wilmington. I then became the vice president to the first Black president. And I came to believe in this kind of soothing narrative about the arc of American history and inclusion. And then, of course, I saw what happened in Charlottesville and the way that Donald Trump talked about good people on both sides. And he said to himself, what I realized then was that the words of a president matter. They can give oxygen to hate, and it can come roaring back. And I will tell you, in my own position as a reporter, I had seen this in 2015, going back to the last campaign. I watched this kind of anti-Semitism up close in sort of chilling detail, people who were feeling empowered to talk about it, all the way up until January 6th. I was down at the Capitol reporting on the events there, and I was shaken. I mean, as a father, as somebody who is, raising Jewish children in this country, it worries me. And I think Biden comes to this with a sense that we are closer, that we have less room to play with our politics than we sometimes might think. That we might sometimes say, okay, you know what, this guy's doing this bad thing, but I like what he's doing over here, and therefore I'm going to allow this thing to happen. Biden is a little bit more aware of the fragility of our security, and he is worried that we have allowed these demons to come forth in our politics. And if we do not beat them back with force, that they can overwhelm us.
So we are nearing the hour. I'm going to ask one more question, Evan, and ask you to, try to answer it as briefly as you can, just because I want Michelle to have the last question. But a number of people have asked in the chat and the Q&A, just kind of in a slightly different direction. Can you just say a little word about Biden's approach to the vice president? Obviously, our vice president is also historic. That warrants another webinar. And just many people are wondering, what should we expect of her and of their relationship and of how he approaches the vice presidency?
Yeah, it's a really important, interesting question. I'm glad it comes up too, because Biden comes to this with a somewhat different set of beliefs than a lot of presidents. A lot of presidents, they find themselves in a kind of shotgun marriage with their vice president. It was usually for, strategic electoral reasons that they found themselves on the ticket. Oftentimes, as we all know, it's the oldest psychodrama in Washington that they don't get along very well, or that the vice president is sort of running for a crypto campaign for president. Biden has a very different view. He was, as we all know, at the end of his Senate career, and he might well have been remembered as somebody who had a perfectly fine record, but nothing that would put him in the history books in a major way. And then Barack Obama came along and sort of plucked him out and said, I want you, I need you, Joe Biden, to help me succeed for specific reasons. One, you know foreign policy and I don't. Two, you like Capitol Hill and I don't. I need you to go over there. And three, let's be honest, you can connect to white voters in the Midwest who I can't. And Biden came into the vice presidency, and he really, I think it changed how he saw himself, because he came to see himself as somebody who was able to help Americans reach a better place in our own history. He was able to help us have the first African-American president, and he nudged history forward in his own way. And then you fast forward, and when it was his opportunity to say, okay, how can I, as a person who has these advantages, who has, as we've talked about, great luck and great misfortune, how can I try to nudge history forward? And one of the ways he could do that was by bringing Kamala Harris into the White House and making history in all the ways we know. The first woman, the first Indian American, and of course, the first African American vice president. And in some ways, that was him sort of saying to Americans, we want this, we can do this, and I'm gonna make that happen. Now, as a functional matter, the vice presidency is something where he really needs her to play a vital role, because he cannot, as to go back to the fact that some young Americans look at him a little bit like a bowl of oatmeal. He knows he can't really try to understand the experience of being young and Black, or being young and an immigrant, and or from an immigrant family. And Kamala Harris can help him both understand. She can kind of bring inputs into the decision-making process that will make it a richer decision. And then also she can help also communicate out to the country what it is they're trying to do. So even when they inevitably do things that irritate people, that at least people understand, well, why are they doing it? And what's the rationale? So that's the role that she's going to play. And we'll find out later. I think there will be some specific portfolios, but in some ways the specific portfolios are less important than the fact that he believes the vice presidency as an institution is vital. And he believes that her specific set of experiences are indispensable to a successful administration.
I loved how you framed the answer in terms of nudging history forward. We have so many specific questions still in the Q&A, more about the Middle East, on global issues, specifically how Biden is going to be able to meet this moment now of the COVID-19 pandemic politically. And there's one question I have that perhaps could encapsulate it all, which is that you have shared with us that you believe that there's an under-examined quality in public life that can have such a profound impact on civil discourse and public life: empathy. In closing, can you reflect on Biden's empathy and how it will either help or hurt him in meeting this moment?
I'm glad you mentioned it, Michelle. It's this word that has sort of almost kind of been somewhat overused. It's kind of leached the meaning out of it, because it sort of feels like, okay, it's the empathy thing. But then I had this moment that began to sort of drive home what it really means, which is that, we all live in very separate places and moments. We all inhabit our own universe of ideas and preferences and policy beliefs and so on. It's very easy for us to dwell in those separate spaces. And then occasionally we have those moments that sort of punch through the crust, and we can begin to actually know what it feels like to live in somebody else's shoes. And there was a moment that I got a hold of during the campaign. The Biden campaign didn't give it to me. I got this from a voter. There was a man in Michigan who had COVID, and he runs a small business. He's a little coffee roastery. And the Biden campaign was getting Joe Biden on the phone every day with as many regular people as they could, one or two, because he was in his house and he was desperate for human contact. And they get him on the phone with this man in Michigan named Mohammed Kazaz. And Mohammed Kazaz, who's a small business owner and a father of two, was holed up in a bedroom in his house because he had COVID and he was desperately trying not to get his kids and his wife sick. And he gets a call from the Democratic nominee, and he begins to record it. And he played it for me later. And Mohammed Kazaz was, as you can imagine, very raw and fragile on that call. I mean, his life is kind of unraveling. And his daughter is outside the door of the bedroom, and she's 2 years old. I say this as the father of somebody who's just turned 3. I know exactly what that sounds like. And she's saying to him, "Daddy, Baba, come out. Come out. Why won't you come out of the room? Baba, come out." And he's telling this to Biden on the phone. And Biden, and Mohammed ended up sort of breaking down on the call, and very emotional. And Biden's just listening to him. And, he's just listening to him. And then he says, Muhammad, I can't pretend to know exactly what you're going through, but I have been through some moments in my life when I had little kids who couldn't quite understand the strain and the pain we were experiencing. And maybe I have a couple of things that might help. You might play a game with her through the door, guessing a number or a color. Little tiny things like that. And, it was he's a competent grandfather for one thing. But what struck me about it was, later I interviewed Muhammad about it. I said, what did you take from that? He said, honestly, he just listened to me. That's it. He just listened to me. And I think there are a huge number of Americans right now who are just desperate that somebody will listen to them in a position of power and influence, that they will just listen to them and understand and empathize with the pain they're experiencing. And Joe Biden, for all of his frailties and weaknesses and mistakes in life, he's ready to listen. And I think we'll probably be a little better off for that.
Evan, thank you for ending on that note, on a note of empathy and on such a sweet story. It's 1:00, so we have to wrap up. I just want to say again, first of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for writing the book. I encourage everyone to read it. And thank you again to Michelle and to Temple Emmanuel for co-hosting with us at CJP, and to all of my CJP colleagues who helped make this happen. I guess I'm just taking away two things. One is the power of a leader who's willing to be public about regret and grief and vulnerability, and how that connects to the empathy we need so badly right now in our community. And two, just faith in people at a time when we can feel so divided and ideology feels so hard to break through on. Trust that if we get in a room and show people respect, we can work through it and nudge history forward. This was awesome. Thank you so much. Michelle?
I just want to add my thanks to Evan. This was absolutely spectacular. Thank you for taking us on this journey today. And of course, to Ruth Nemzoff, who is the most awesome mother-in-law, and to you, Mark, and to Dan behind the scenes for your technical wizardry, to CJP for your sponsorship, and to each of you who joined us for this conversation. May we be able to engage in many more. Thank you all.